On July 2, 1931, Peter Curtin was set to be executed after being convicted of murder. What was most disturbing was his wish to hear his own blood drip from his neck even after it was beheaded. Here are some of the most disturbing last wishes of famous serial killers. February 20th, 1926. Earl Nelson entered the boarding house of Clara Newman, a wealthy 60-year-old San Francisco landlady, posing as a potential tenant named Roger Wilson, after which he would strangle Newman before raping her dead body. Now this was just one of 22 others he gruesomely murdered, and another 22 he attacked. Born in 1897, Nelson had a very troubled upbringing. He was orphaned from a young age and raised by his strict grandmother. Even as a child, there were signs of something deeply wrong: violent outbursts, odd behavior, and a very odd fascination with the Bible that bordered on obsessive. A head injury at the age of 10 only made it worse. He would spend his time in mental institutions, but doctors eventually released him, despite knowing of his disturbing tendencies. By the mid-1920s, more specifically around 1926, Nelson went on a killing spree, targeting mostly landladies and middle-aged women. His method was chillingly consistent. He would pose as a potential renter, gain entry to their homes, and then strangle them in a violent frenzy. The next to last of his victims was a 13-year-old girl named Lola Cohen, and she was one of 3 victims to be significantly mutilated after death. His sheer strength and unrelenting brutality earned him the nickname the Gorilla Killer. By 1927, law enforcement had caught up with him. After a manhunt across multiple states and Canada, Nelson was finally arrested in Winnipeg. His trial was swift, and the jury wasted no time sentencing him to death. Now, here's where it gets creepier. His last wish. Nelson, a devoutly religious man, despite his heinous crimes, requested to be buried with a Bible on his chest when he was executed by hanging on January 13, 1928. It's as if he believed that placing a Bible on his body would somehow redeem his soul, despite the horrors he inflicted on his victims. But it gets weirder. Just before his execution, Nelson remained calm, even smiling at times. When the noose was placed around his neck, he showed no fear. His last recorded words, "I forgive those who have wronged me." It was a haunting statement from a man who had brutally murdered at least 22 women, showing zero remorse throughout his trial. Richard Kuklinski, better known as the Iceman, wasn't your typical serial killer. This guy was a hitman for the mob, taking out targets with terrifying precision. Now, what made him so scary? His ability to kill without hesitation, his complete lack of remorse, and the brutal ways he disposed of his victims. Born in 1935 in New Jersey, Kuklinski had a rough childhood. His father was a violent alcoholic who regularly beat him and his siblings. His mother, deeply religious but equally abusive, only made things worse. By the time he was a teenager, Richard had already committed his first murder, beating a neighborhood bully to death with a wooden pole. But that was just the beginning. By the 1950s, Kuklinski had caught the attention of the DeCavalcante crime family, the real-life inspiration for The Sopranos. He became their go-to enforcer, carrying out murders with ruthless efficiency. Over the years, he worked with multiple crime families, perfecting his craft. His methods? Absolutely insane. He shot, strangled, poisoned, and even used cyanide mist to kill his targets. But the most disturbing part? He even froze some of his victims' bodies to confuse the time of death, earning him the nickname the Iceman. For decades, he lived a double life, a brutal killer by day, a loving husband and father by night. His family had no clue about his secret profession, but that all ended in 1986, when an FBI sting took him down. Kuklinski was convicted of 5 murders, though he claimed to have killed over 100 people. He was sentenced to life in prison, where he finally embraced his infamy, giving multiple interviews about his chilling career. Now, let's talk about his disturbing last wish. Kuklinski spent nearly 20 years behind bars before his health began to fail. He was diagnosed with a rare inflammatory disease and was in and out of the prison hospital. In 2006, at age 70, he was on his deathbed when he made this unusual request. He wanted to watch The Godfather one last time while eating steak, spaghetti, and a salad. It's like he wanted to relive his mobster days in his final moments. Even weirder, his wife Barbara was given the option to pull the plug or keep him on life support. She chose to let him die. Conspiracy theories will tell you that he was poisoned to prevent him from testifying against a powerful mobster. But it didn't matter because just like that, the Iceman melted away. If there was a serial killer who truly loved the thrill of terror, it was Peter Kürten. This guy wasn't just a murderer. He was a monster who fed off of fear. His crimes were so brutal that even the most hardened investigators were left shaken. Born back in 1883 in Germany, Kürten had a horrific childhood. His father was a very violent alcoholic who physically and sexually abused the entire family. Peter's early exposure to violence turned him into a walking nightmare. When he was just a child, he had already experimented with cruelty by torturing animals and even drowning a friend at the age of 9. That would be his first kill, and he loved it. As he grew older, his crimes escalated. By the 1920s, Dusseldorf became his hunting ground. He targeted men, women, and children, attacking with scissors, knives, hammers, and sometimes his bare hands. But what made him truly sick was his fascination with blood. After stabbing victims, he would sometimes drink their blood, earning him the chilling nickname, the Vampire of Dusseldorf. Kürten didn't just enjoy killing, he relished the fear he created. At one point, he even sent taunting letters to police, describing his murders in gruesome detail. He thrived on the attention, knowing that the entire city was paralyzed by terror. Now, his downfall came in 1930 when one of his victims, Maria Budlik, miraculously escaped and led the police straight to him. During his trial, Kürten openly admitted to 9 murders, though the real number may have been higher, and he would show zero remorse. Instead, he described his killings with excitement, as if he were reminiscing about fond memories. And now, let's talk about that insanely disturbing last wish. On July 2, 1931, Kürten was set to be executed by guillotine. Most people facing that would probably pray, cry, or at least show some kind of fear. But not him. Instead, Kürten's final request was as twisted as his crimes. He asked his executioner,
"Tell me, after my head is chopped off, will I still be able to hear the sound of my own blood gushing from my neck?"
That sick puppy wanted to experience his own execution, to hear his blood spill, just like his victims had, as if it were one final thrill before his death.
Not because I was angry with them, not because I hated them, but because I wanted to keep them with me.
Between 1978 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer brutally murdered and dismembered 17 young men, engaging in necrophilia and even cannibalism. Now, what made Dahmer really disturbing was how normal he looked on the surface. Jeffrey grew up in Ohio, and from a young age, he showed disturbing tendencies. This guy was fascinated with dead animals, often collecting roadkill and dissecting it. By his teenage years, he was drinking heavily and feeling an overwhelming attraction to the idea of controlling others, especially men. His first murder happened in 1978 when he picked up 18-year-old hitchhiker Stephen Hicks and lured him back to his place for some drinks, and then killed him when he tried to leave. Dahmer methodically disposed of the body, crushing the bones and scattering them in the woods. Over the next decade, he continued killing, refining his horrifying methods. He would drug his victims, strangle them, and perform gruesome post-mortem acts, sometimes keeping body parts as trophies. His Milwaukee apartment became a house of horrors. When police finally caught him in 1991, they found severed heads in the fridge, human hearts in the freezer, a 57-gallon drum filled with decomposing remains. And at his trial, Dahmer would show little emotion. He pled guilty and insisted he wasn't insane. The judge gave him 16 life terms, over 900 years in prison. But here's where it gets more unsettling. Unlike most serial killers who either remain defiant or even try to fight their punishment, Dahmer seemed almost resigned. He reportedly told guards that he deserved to die, and even asked to be put in the general prison population, despite knowing it was basically a death sentence. And then came his bizarre last wish. Now Dahmer, a man who had taken so many lives in the most gruesome ways imaginable, claimed he had found God. He requested a Bible and asked to be baptized in prison, as if this is going to somehow erase all the horror he had committed. Many saw it as an attempt at redemption, but others believed it was just this other manipulative act, one last mind game from a man who had spent his life controlling others. But it didn't matter because karma had other plans. Because in November 1994, Dahmer was attacked by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver in the prison's bathroom. Scarver bludgeoned him to death with a metal bar, smashing his skull. Jeffrey died almost instantly, never really getting the chance to live out his so-called redemption. But his last wish, apart from his request for his body to be cremated, he did express his desire to be baptized and forgiven. But even after the monstrosities he committed, the question remains, did he really believe he could be saved? Or was it just another twisted chapter in his horrifying story? It's December 22nd, 1978, and Andrei Shishkov lures a girl named Yelena Zakotnova to an old shabby hut that he had secretly purchased, after which he gruesomely murders her. Now this would be the first of 52 murders he was convicted, which earned him the nicknames the Rostov Ripper and the Butcher of Rostov. Born in 1936 in Ukraine, Shishkov grew up during Stalin's reign of terror, and his childhood was something straight out of your worst nightmare. His family starved during the Holodomor famine, and his mother terrified him with stories of children being eaten by starving villagers, including his own older brother, whom she claimed had been eaten by their hungry neighbors. So by the time he was an adult, Shishkov had become this quiet, awkward man. He would struggle with impotence, which fueled his rage. And really, the only thing that excited him was murder. Between 1978 and 90, he murdered over 50 people, most of them young women and children. His method? Pure savagery. He would lure victims into the woods, stab them repeatedly, mutilate their bodies, and in some cases cannibalize their remains. What's even more terrifying? The Soviet police had no clue. They arrested the wrong man even, executing one innocent person, while Shishkov kept on killing. This guy was finally caught in 1990 when an undercover cop noticed him acting strangely near a train station, his favorite hunting ground. When they searched him, they found a knife, rope, and Vaseline, his killing kit. Game over. Shishkov's trial in 1992 was a complete circus. Locked in an iron cage, he howled, sang, and ranted like a madman, trying to convince the court he was insane, but the judge wasn't buying it. After hours of listening to this horrific testimony, he sentenced Shishkov to death. And here's where his disturbing last wish comes in. In 1994, when his execution was imminent, Shishkov begged to be shot in the head. Sounds pretty simple, right? But here's the twist. He wanted it to be up close and personal, so he could see the barrel of the gun as the trigger was pulled. It was believed that he wanted to experience his own death the same way his victims had, in absolute terror. On February 14, 1994, Shishkov's wish was granted. He was taken to a soundproof room, forced to kneel, and with one bullet to the back of the head, behind the right ear, the Butcher of Rostov was no more.
The clowning was relaxation for me. I enjoyed entertaining kids. Like some people are, they unwind in different ways, either by going out drinking or that. I could put on clown makeup and I was relaxed.
John Wayne Gacy, better known as the Killer Clown. If there ever was a serial killer who embodied pure horror, it was this guy. On the surface, pretty normal guy. A successful contractor, active in politics, even performed at children's parties as Pogo the Clown. But we all know behind the face paint and smiles, Gacy was hiding one of the darkest secrets imaginable. Between 1972 and 78, Gacy preyed on young men and boys, luring him to his home in Chicago with promises of work, money, or even just a friendly hangout. Once they got inside, the real nightmare began. Gacy would trick him into putting on handcuffs, claiming it was a magic trick. But there was no trick here, only torture. He assaulted, strangled, and murdered at least 33 boys and young men, burying most of them in his crawl space under the house. The smell of death eventually became so unbearable that his neighbors would eventually notice. John's reign of terror ended in December 1978 when police finally searched his house and uncovered the horror beneath it. The sheer scale of his crimes stunned the world, and at his trial, he often joked about his murders and even compared himself to famous politicians, as if his kill count was something to brag about. Although in 1980, he was sentenced to death, but would spend 14 years on death row, painting disturbing self-portraits of himself as a clown. Then came his execution in 1994, and with it, his unsettling last wish. Many prisoners facing execution have a moment of reflection, maybe even regret sometimes. Not Gacy. No, he treated his last day like some kind of farewell party. For his final meal, we have the disturbingly indulgent feast of a bucket of KFC fried chicken, French fries, a dozen shrimp, and strawberries. The fried chicken part, extra creepy. When you remember that before his killing spree, Gacy managed several KFC restaurants. And as he was led to the execution chamber, Gacy remained defiant, showing no remorse for the lives he destroyed. His final words?
Kiss my ass.
No apology, no last-minute confession. Just one last arrogant remark before it all ended. But even in death, Gacy's evil left a mark. That execution didn't go so smoothly. The IV line got clogged, delaying the process, and made it one of the longest lethal injections in history. Some would even see it as a final ironic twist. For Gacy, the man who inflicted so much suffering, was now experiencing a drawn-out end himself. But in the end, Gacy died as he lived, smug, heartless, and utterly terrifying. November 30th, 1989. Eileen Wuornos shot 51-year-old Richard Charles Mallory, killing him instantly. Now, what was most unsettling here was the statement she made moments before her eventual execution. You see, Wuornos didn't have a normal childhood. Far from it. She was abandoned by her mother, never met her father, who was in prison for child molestation and later took his own life. She was raised by abusive grandparents, and by her early teens, she was homeless, surviving by any means necessary, including prostitution. Life had already hardened her long before she ever committed her first murder. But between 1989 and 90, Wuornos goes on this killing spree, murdering at least 7 men. She claimed they had either assaulted or tried to assault her while she was working as a sex worker. But the evidence? It painted a different picture. Most of her victims were shot multiple times, and some showed no signs of struggle. It looked less like self-defense and more like cold-blooded murder. Now, she was finally caught in 1991, tricked by police into confessing on tape. Her former lover, Tyria Moore, cooperated with law enforcement, urging Wuornos to come clean. And she did, admitting to the murders but insisting they were all in self-defense. The jury didn't buy it. In 1992, she was sentenced to death, and over the next 10 years, she sat on death row, growing more unstable by the day. Now, by the time her execution date rolled around in 2002, Wuornos wasn't just unremorseful. She seemed completely unhinged. She claimed that the prison was torturing her with sonic pressure, insisting she was being controlled by mind games, and rambled on about how the world was corrupt, which she had a point. In her last interview, though, she would rant about how she was coming back on Judgment Day, and that she'd be watching from above. And then there was the last wish. Many inmates do really request a feast for their last meal, but Wuornos didn't ask for anything special. Just a simple cup of coffee. That's it. Almost like she didn't care. Maybe she was too far gone mentally, or maybe she just wanted to get it over with. Either way, on October 9th, 2002, she was executed by lethal injection. Her final words,
"I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back, like Independence Day, with Jesus, June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back."
Even in death, Wuornos left the world unsettled. A woman who'd spent her life on the fringes of society, feared and hated, went out exactly the same way, defiant and unforgettable. On September 5th, 1930, one of the most unrepentant and vicious criminals in the history of serial killers was executed. But what's most unsettling here would be his last words, of course, summing up his entire existence. June 28, 1891, Carl Panzram was born on a farm near East Grand Forks in Minnesota. Now, he was the sixth of 7 children, born to East Prussian immigrants in a strict and brutal household. From a young age, he and his siblings would be forced to work tirelessly on their farm, sometimes all night, with barely 2 hours of sleep before school. Punishments at home were severe: chains, starvation, relentless beatings, all part of daily life here. Carl never really fit with any of the other kids, and later admitted that by age 5, he'd already become a liar and a thief. By the time he was 7, his father abandoned the family, and one by one, his older brothers left as well. Now left in a broken home, Panzram quickly turned to crime and alcohol, getting his first criminal charge at age 8 for being drunk and disorderly. By 11, he was arrested again for being incorrigible after getting drunk and stealing from neighbors. Hoping to reform him, his mother sends him off to Minnesota State Training School, a house of horrors where children were beaten, tortured, and raped. They have a room called the paint shop because kids often left it covered in bruises and blood. Now, Panzram burnt that school to the ground and never looked back. By his teens, he was a drifter, surviving on theft and violence. Carl Panzram wasn't just a serial killer. He was a walking nightmare who murdered, raped, and burnt buildings down just because he could. He famously said,
"I hate the whole damn human race. I would kill everyone if I could."
Despite his monstrous actions, he was brutally honest. While in prison, a young guard named Henry Lesser showed him some kindness, which prompted Panzram to write his autobiography, a chilling, first-hand account where he explicitly denied having any remorse for anything he did, and began his journal with the statement,
"In my lifetime, I've murdered 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and, last but not least, I've committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all these, I am not in the least bit sorry. I have no conscience, so that does not worry me."
After years of escaping prisons, the final thing he stole before getting caught for good was a radio. Compared to his usual crimes, it was almost laughable. So he wouldn't request a special last meal or any kind of comfort. Instead, he had one final act of defiance. He spat in the face of morality and society until the very end. When asked for his last words, he insulted the executioner and mocked the entire process, even in death, by simply saying,
"Hurry it up, you hoser bastard. I could kill 10 men while you're fooling around."
His life was pure rage, and he made sure that the world knew it. This guy was hanged in 1930 at Leavenworth Prison. September 4th, 1989. Dodd went to David Douglas Park with a fish fillet knife and shoelaces, where he lured 2 brothers, after which he tied them to a tree, performed sex acts on them, and then stabbed them to death. However, unlike some other serial killers, he knew the dangers that would follow if he was ever released. Born in 1961, Wesley Allen Dodd grew up in what seemed like a normal suburban home. But by the time he was a teenager, his mind was already twisted beyond repair. We have other kids worrying about school and sports, but Dodd was obsessed with harming children. His first crimes were pretty small, but still disturbing. He would flash himself to neighborhood kids, try to lure them into secluded areas. But here's the worst part. He kept getting away with it. Each time he was caught, the authorities let him off with a slap on the wrist. No one saw the monster he was becoming. By By 1989, things take a nightmarish turn. Dodd kidnapped, tortured, and killed 3 young boys. We know this because he kept a diary detailing everything he did, describing the crimes in sickening detail. But he wasn't done here. He had an even darker plan. He wanted to kidnap more children, build a torture chamber, and turn it into his own personal dungeon of horror. Now, thank God, before he could carry out those plans, he made a crucial mistake. When he tried to abduct his next victim, this boy fought back and escaped. That led to Dodd's arrest. And this time, there was no getting out of it. Now, at his trial, Dodd wouldn't beg for mercy. He didn't plead insanity. In fact, he didn't even want a trial. He demanded to be executed as soon as possible. His reasoning? Well, he said he could never stop killing, and that there was no hope of rehabilitation. And that, my friends, brings us to his disturbing last wish. He stated in one court brief before his execution,
I must be executed before I have an opportunity to escape or kill someone else. If I do escape, I promise you I will kill and again, and I will enjoy every minute of it.
That's not all. Dodd didn't want just any execution. He wanted it to be done by hanging. Now, he specifically requested an old-fashioned Wild West-style execution, claiming it was the most fitting punishment for his crimes. It was a shocking request because hanging had been outlawed for decades in most states, but Washington made an exception. On January 5, 1993, Dodd became the first person to be hanged in the U.S. since 1965. His final moments? He wouldn't flinch, didn't beg, did not cry. He just stood there, waiting. And when the trapdoor was opened, Wesley Allen Dodd fell into darkness, taking his twisted mind with him. Some say justice was served that day. Others say he got off too easy. One thing's for sure, no one missed him. On May 25, 1928, Albert Fish lures a young girl by promising her a party, but instead takes her to this abandoned house. There, he strangled her to death and dismembered her body, and would even cook parts of her to satisfy his grotesque cravings. We take you back to 1870. Fish seemed doomed from the start. His family had a history of mental illness, and by the time he was a toddler, he was already showing signs that something was deeply wrong. While other kids played their little games, Fish found joy in pain, his own and others. He would whip himself with belts, push needles into his body, and even eat raw meat because he loved the taste of blood. By the time this guy was an adult, he had turned into a full-blown monster. Fish had preyed on children, not just harming them, but torturing them in the most grotesque ways you can imagine. He claimed to have killed at least 100 people, but his most infamous crime was what he did to Grace Budd in 1928. Little Gracie was a 10-year-old girl whose family trusted Fish when he offered to take her to a party. But there was no party, just a trap. He took her to this abandoned house, killed her, and then cooked parts of her body. Years later, he even bragged about it in a chilling letter to her mother. A letter so horrific that detectives refused to release it in full. That letter was his true last wish. You see, Albert Fish didn't just want to kill. He wanted his victims' families to suffer forever. Even after he was sentenced to death by electric chair, he insisted that the letter be read after his execution. He wanted Grace Budd's mother to know every vile detail, to imagine the horrors her daughter endured, to never sleep peacefully again. It wasn't about confession or guilt. This was all about control. He wanted the last word, the final torment. On January 16, 1936, Fish got what he deserved. The first jolt of electricity didn't even kill him. Thanks to the needles he had shoved into his own body over the years, the circuit was interrupted. It took 2 jolts to finally end him. His last words, a chilling,
I don't even know why I'm here.
But Fish knew exactly why. And long after he was gone, his letter ensured that the nightmare lived on.